When you think of prison, you're probably thinking about some pretty harsh and borderline inhumane living conditions. Obviously, these conditions would vary from country to country. Prisons in Japan, though, are like no other prisons in the world. Japanese prisons follow very strict schedules. Talking is allowed, but only during exercise and free time. Oh, and inmates are only allowed to speak Japanese. Most inmates are put in community cells, which can hold anywhere between 6 to 12 inmates. The rooms are Japanese style, which means inmates sleep on Japanese futons and the flooring is tatami. Sometimes foreign inmates are placed separately in Western-style rooms with beds or Japanese-style solitary cells. The general schedule is quite mundane, but if it isn't followed to a T, consequences will be harsh, which we'll look more into later. Prisoners will wake up at 6:45 a.m. sharp and have breakfast for an hour. Then comes work. For these prisoners, work basically takes up their entire day, spanning from 8 a.m. until 4:40 p.m., with just a few short breaks in between. Next comes dinner at 5 p.m. with 2 hours of free time. Finally, lights are out at 9 p.m. sharp, and the cycle continues. Prison work includes woodworking, printing, cooking, and cleaning, as well as vocational training aimed at obtaining qualifications that can be used after being released from prison. Inmates are paid for this work, and this money can be collected after being released. During free time, inmates are allowed to watch television, read books, and quietly chat with one another. However, these must all be done in Japanese. These rules can become problems for foreign prisoners, especially if they aren't fluent in the native language. Fuchu prison is the location where the majority of foreign offenders will find themselves doing time in Japan. It's known for being notoriously strict, and aside from the foreigners, it also houses various members of the Yakuza. The well-known gangster Shinobu Tsukatsu Komicho did a 5-year sentence at Fuchu prison, which ended in 2011 for violations of the swords and firearms law. Shinobu also enjoyed a 13-year sentence in the 1970s for murdering a fellow gang member with a samurai sword. There's a little fun fact for you. In December 2015, Fuchu prison was the largest prison in Japan, holding about 2,086 prisoners. The cells in the prison are divided into 4 categories: normal prisoners, foreign prisoners, mentally ill prisoners, and physically disabled prisoners. Male foreign prisoners in Japan are usually housed at Fuchu prison. Foreigners are incarcerated for various crimes, but all in single cells in 2 or 3 blocks. Although Japanese prisons in general are notoriously strict, to the point of garnering condemnation from multiple human rights groups, it seems like Fuchu prison has gotten a lot of flack in specific. On the other hand, Tochigi is a regular women's prison that's also designated to hold foreigners. It's located in a rural area north of Tokyo, and is organized along the same lines as Fuchu prison, though the overall regime is definitely less harsh here. The procedures described for Fuchu prison are applicable to Tochigi prison as well, with a few small differences. The English language holdings at the prison library are much smaller than at Fuchu prison. The U.S. Embassy, however, is currently contributing books to increase the holdings. And instead of training auto mechanics or carpenters, Tochigi prison offers training for beauticians, Japanese typists, and seamstresses. Now, although it may seem like the conditions here are less harsh, many foreign prisoners have claimed otherwise. For example, Joanne Mariner, an American prison specialist for Human Rights Watch, said, "It smacks of totalitarianism. There's an obsession with rules and with absolute strict obedience to rules. When they believe rules have not been followed, then there's arbitrary punishment." Yuichi Kaido, who was a lawyer for an American foreign prisoner referred to as Mr. Mara, had described the conditions by saying that in one point in history, American prisoners were seen as being slaves of the state, and that those words would describe the current situation of Japanese prisons pretty accurately. It should also be noted that in a lot of cases regarding foreign inmates, Japanese prisons try to save face and make themselves look better than they actually are to appease international standards. So information coming directly from them should be taken with a grain of salt. So, how does someone get here in the first place? While a prisoner is awaiting trial in Japan, which could take months or even years depending on the details of the case, they would first spend time in keisatsusho, or the police jail. During this phase, the prosecutor and the police will collect evidence regarding the case. If it's something relatively simple, like an assault, they would still be confined for 1 to 5 months here. To add to that, the conditions here are generally very harsh. Once a prisoner is moved to a regional detention facility, the conditions usually are a bit more comfortable. However, rules here are still to be strictly maintained, with a tight adherence being observed during meal times. The food is to be taken in the room, in which the portions are highly controlled and have to be eaten very quickly. For the daily head count, all rooms are to be spotless and clean. Members of the cell have to be sitting in a seiza position in the front of the cell door and shout their prisoner number in Japanese. Up next, cells and living conditions. Most Japanese inmates are placed in community cells. These conditions are similar to those found at the regular county jail, but are stricter. For the Japanese, who tend to grow up in a system of rules and face heavy pressure to adhere to these things, it's still a difficult position to be in. And for foreigners, who don't have the cultural background and lifestyle training, it's even worse. Foreign prisoners are often, but not always, put in different accommodations. Although some have said that foreigners are provided with beds, sometimes they're actually put in small, solitary cells for the time of their sentence. Now, to the uninitiated, this might seem like a good thing, but in reality, it isn't. The isolation of being totally alone with no one to talk to for months and months can be devastating. Some inmates in these solitary cells not only sleep and eat in them, but are also made to carry out their assigned labor in them. They're let out of the cells only to exercise, during which time communication with other inmates is still forbidden. Again, we want to mention that when looking at reports or images of living conditions, they're usually handled by the Japanese authorities, who, after inspection, will allow them to be distributed. These usually won't be a reflection of the realities of the real prison experience, which, according to many former prisoners, is quite filthy and cold. Rules absolutely define one's existence in Japanese prisons down to the minute. If you follow them exactly, you can sometimes accumulate certain privileges. But if you diverge even slightly from the long list of rules, you will be harshly punished, even in a draconian fashion. Some of these rules include when and how to place each item inside the cell, where you can write things down, only in specified notebooks which are thoroughly inspected,